So today we've gathered today to discuss the results of the research together with the key stakeholders and the experts, as well as to develop a number of practical recommendations, particularly for the MOD, how to overcome these challenges. Today we are waiting for having the head of the Center for Documentation Information of NATO, Veneta Kleine. We're expecting her to join us online. And before coming straight to the major briefing for today on this research that I've just mentioned, I would like to state that today we have with us the special advisor on defense from UK, Mr. Malloy. We are very happy to see you here. UK is the strategic partner to Ukraine on the national security and defense. It provides considerable assistance and support to the MOD and the armed forces of Ukraine. And of course, the UK supports the development of the GDI index from the moment of its establishment. So, Martin, why is it for UK is so important to support the defense integrity in Ukraine and in the world on the overall?
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to speak in English. My Ukrainian isn't good enough to give this introduction in Ukrainian. But good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today representing the British Embassy and Ambassador Simmons, who unfortunately is in the UK at the UK-Ukrainian Strategic Dialogue. But the UK recognises the importance of the Government Defence Integrity Index. The British government, as has been mentioned, has supported the index since its very foundation. And the concepts of transparency and anti-corruption, especially within the defence sector, are the foundation of good governance, and that's why we support it. They're also the foundation of military professionalism, integrity and capability. The UK specifically has been supporting GDI as we see it as the fulcrum or the centre of our approach and support to building integrity and anti-corruption process across the armed forces of Ukraine. It provides the basis for the UK government's support to the Building Integrity and Anti-Corruption Centre at the National Defence University, for which we are the lead support nation, as well as our assistance to the Internal Audit Department of the Ministry of Defence. However, transparency and anti-corruption, it's largely about the people, whether that is the soldier on the front line having better access to the kit and equipment because of reduced losses through corrupt activities, or whether it is the average citizen that sees their taxes being spent wisely and in pursuit of the objectives of the state, or whether it's about those individuals currently within the temporary occupied territories who look with envy on the professionalism and morality of those within the Ukrainian defence sector, and we need to work and improve that. It's for all of those reasons and more that the UK government is proud to be here today in support of this latest update of the Government Defence Integrity Index for Central and Eastern Europe, and we urge all parties to work together to recognise the importance of anti-corruption and to take all the necessary steps to reduce it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Malloy, and thank you for supporting Ukraine and our Ministry of Defense. Давайте.
So let's get to the most important aspect in our agenda, to our research. The partner of Transparency International in the field of this research, that is on the GDI, was NAKO. And today we have Olena Trihub, that is the representative of NAKO Independent Anti-Corruption Commission, to speak on this research, and she will explain this 41 out of 100 possible points, whether that's good or not, and what major concerns arise out of the results of the research.
Якщо є хтось, хто вміє користуватися.
If there's anyone who knows how to use this switch, then it's Olena. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. representatives of various organizations. We have gathered today the representatives of public associations, volunteers, and the society, as this index is very important to all of us, as we know that the defense and security sector is a crucial one that encompasses civil society and not only the Ministry of Defense. And that is why it would be absolutely crucial to have a discussion around the assessment of the research results. What is this assessment about? The GDI, that's the analysis of control over the corruption risks in the defense and security sector. And our organization, Transparency International Security and Defense, that's the organization that we, NAKO, represent in Ukraine. We are part of this organization, and this index is being researched every 5 years. So the Transparency International assesses different countries of the world under 5 major categories: political, procurement, personnel, financial, and military operations. So the risks in those 5 categories. And the most recent assessment was conducted over a period of 2020. And today we'll be talking on the results of this assessment. And we have to mention that such countries as New Zealand, Belgium, and Germany, Norway, Netherlands, Switzerland, Taiwan, and UK, by the way, these were the countries that scored the highest amount of points in this rating. They were considered as the countries with the lowest level of corruption risks in the sector. As for Ukraine, unfortunately, we remained at the very same place we had previously. That is Group D. That was the assessment that we got 2015 by the Transparency International, and unfortunately, we remained at the same place of this rating. And hopefully the representatives of the Ministry of Defense would be able to support whether we could possibly turn to Group C. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to do that so far. Now, just a few words on the comparison. I've got a small rating here. So Ukraine scored just the same as Hungary, that is 41 points. And, oh, by the way, Russia scored worth. Russia has received only 36 points, then Chile, Argentina, Albania. They also scored worse than Ukraine. But the countries like Serbia, like Armenia, Portugal, Greece, they are in the same group as Ukraine, although they have more points. And as you can see now, this is the ratings, and that indicates the most vulnerable areas for Ukraine. That's so political, procurement, personnel, financial, and operational risks. The highest are the procurement risks. This is something that we're going to discuss during the roundtable. Then financial risks and the risks of military operations. Those were the greatest risks. Speaking on the military operations, we have to mention that there is a well-known fact that in countries where there is a conflict, the corruption risks increases. And since we do have an active phase of a military conflict in eastern Ukraine, so naturally we do have this high level of risk that's color-coded in red. Then we have a lot of political risks, and even though we have received an A level, because we have adopted a lot of anti-corruption policies at the level of the MOD and at the level of the nation. And we have here the representative of the National Agency for Corruption Prevention. And strategically in Ukraine, there is a policy adopted on countering the corruption. This is a well-known fact. Then we have high risks in the field of procurements. There is a lot of challenges with regards to procurements, and this is because, according to UK experts, there is a lack of oversight over the procurements. Then there is weak competition and high level of secrecy. We are all aware of those aspects, so we'll have a discussion on why are we so slow in implementing the procurements reform in Ukraine, since everyone knows that this is a vulnerable area for Ukraine. Then there is a block of financial risks, which are also challenging, because the largest risks in this finances are all about the control over the state property. As you know, the Ministry of Defense has control over around 100 of public enterprises, and we've analyzed and we've mentioned that those enterprises there are problematic. There is lack of oversight. They don't have any corporate governance standards. Of course, we do have Ukроборонпром, and by the way, I'm grateful to have the representatives of Ukроборонпром here with us today. They're responsible for compliance and anti-corruption policy. Unfortunately, Ukроборонпром is still not reformed, but it has already initiated the reformation process. As you know, the Verkhovna Rada has approved the law on the corporatization of the Ukроборонпром. So hopefully when this will happen, the assessment of Ukraine and this sector will be higher. In the most recent block, these are the personnel risks and the risks of military operations. Now, in here, I would like to mention that there are challenges with military doctoring, with the operational training, and the timely planning. Besides, there is not so much capabilities in terms of monitoring of corruption in the eastern operations, as I don't think there's too many people who do the monitoring over the corruption aspects.
So these are the general comments, and we have to move forward step by step with our reformation process. Our organization, NAKO, prioritized these objectives aimed at fighting corruption and improving this GDI index. So we believe it's a priority to reinforce, to enhance the civil control over military operations. So far, we haven't got sufficient legislation in this field to divide the authorities based on the best NATO standards. We recommend that the Minister of Defense and the first deputies of the minister are civilians, and the personnel department have to be proactive. That would make the selection of personnel effective and transparent in defense and security sector. We also would like to highlight that we need to finalize this lengthy procurement reform in defense sector. The MOD has to launch procurement procedures based on the new standards, and we recommend that the central procurement organization has to be restored. Without it, it wouldn't be possible to professionalize procurement. It has a very short life, so to say. And one more point, register of the bidders would help to prevent corruption. And the third block, which we would like to highlight, what's feasible right now in Ukraine. We could realistically aim at lowering the level of secrecy in the procurement. We know that defense procurement law does not solve this problem, and I would like to mention the new law about the security of classified information. It is now at the stage of the parliamentary committee. We have to streamline this kind of work, and we hope that with this new law, our procurement procedures and processes will be better aligned with the NATO standards. To finalize my presentation, I would say that GDI is aimed not only at the MOD. We, of course, invited representatives of the ministry because they are the largest budgetary owner in the defense sector. And you have the broadest authority, and you have the highest risks, of course. So in order for this index to be effective, we need cooperation among all the stakeholders, including the members of the parliament and the members of the committee. Unfortunately, they are not with us today. We also invite and engage other institutions and agencies, the Ministry of the Interior, because this is a large sector. We have to start somewhere. And I hope that the MOD, as the key institution of this sector, would be able to share their achievements today in this anti-corruption field, what steps and measures they have implemented that would give us some hope for better scores in the future. Thank you very much, Olena. Thank you, dear participants, for making notes from this presentation. I would like also to underscore one important side of this study, namely the assessment of the institution, namely the Oversight Committee under the Parliament of Ukraine. The score makes it D group for us, for Ukraine. Unfortunately, we don't have representatives of this committee here now. We invited Mariana Bezugla as a representative. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it here. And she informed us about this in the morning. Nonetheless, it does not mean that the parliamentary oversight is not realized. I would like to ask whether Solomia Bobrovska is with us online, the MP. Can we have her on the screen now, please? Let me remind you that she is the Secretary of the Parliament of Ukraine on interparliamentary cooperation, and she represents Ukraine in the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO. Do we have Solomia already? Yeah, she's here. We need to both hear and see Solomia. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Unfortunately, I cannot hear you. Despite the fact that Solomia Bobrovska is not representing the relevant committee of the Parliament of Ukraine, she is still realizing the oversight in anti-corruption processes, especially in the food procurement in the defense and security sector. I'm interested to hear more about the tenders and your reports to the Ministry of Defense based on the assessment of these bidding processes. What can you tell us about your work in 2020 and what can be done to improve the oversight in anti-corruption procedures? Good morning, everyone. Now I am in one of the units on the ground, and we have these soft units here, which indicate that they are ready for the military operations.
It means that those procurements that are conducted by the MOD fully fulfill all of their needs, including all of the fundamental needs for performing common operations, not to cut the grass, but to fulfill military operations. And in fact, today I'd like to divide my presentation into a number of aspects in response to your inquiry, in response to your question, since today we are talking about the corruption risks and corruption practices, particularly in the field of procurements within MOD. I would like to divide them into two broad sort of aspects, the overall risks and fairly specific risks. And first of all, Elena was absolutely true to mention there's too many secrecy with the procurements and prevents the public oversight over the MOD. They are not able to see some fundamental needs for this or that military units. They are not available. They are not able to see what the country is buying, and this is not something that is happening in the NATO countries. I mean, we're having an interesting situation. Aggressor knows what we are buying, but our own citizens doesn't know what we are buying, and that's an example of corrupt practices. And I believe that Molot and Bogdan, these are the best examples of how you could conspire with the manufacturers of different products. And we have defense procurements, defense-related procurements. We're talking about the weapons and equipment, everything which is under the state defense order, which is mentioned in the public environment. But still, there's one more aspect. For example, the food supplies, the rear supplies, the clothing support, and then there is a separate area that's the construction of infrastructure and supply the social needs of the military personnel. And unfortunately, those final two components, they don't have too much of the attention. And how do we develop the situation? By introducing different draft laws. For example, a draft law on the classified information that would be add-on to the law on the procurements. And unfortunately, there is not too many focus on that. And the journalists are not tracing the procurements, even the open procurements. I was really surprised with the procurements in the field of food supplies. And the same would happen with regards to the monopoly suppliers in the field of petroleum oil and lubricants, particularly. Only two companies are participating in the biddings on that. And we have basically only one company, the Agrinol, which is supplying the POL, which results in a lot of malfunctions for the military equipment. And Agrinol turned to be, a Ukrainian and Russian-owned company. Now it's as if Ukrainian-owned company, but still it's also popular among the armed forces. But let's have another example, an example of fuel which is bought at a higher prices and nobody is controlling that. And particularly in the unit that I'm here, it has the malfunctions of 3 vehicles, and now it requires a complete maintenance. They would need to make sure it's cleaned, it's properly repaired and maintained. So those are the aspects that are absolutely crucial to mention. Oh, by the way, the construction of the barracks and finalization of the constructions that was launched in 2015-2019 under the administration of the Poroshenko. I'm not going to say about the effectiveness and the accommodating of male personnel in those barracks, that there's the block system in those barracks, but I would like to underline there's around 200 of the barracks around Ukraine, and since 2019 not a single hryvnia was spent on the repairs of those barracks. So we basically resulting in a situation when those barracks that were absolutely new in 2019, they're having a lot of problems when the roof is being broken, when the concrete is still on the floor or on the around that barracks, and nobody's taking care of that. Then the accommodation facility and the accommodation department and the MOD was dissolved. All of that results in a situation that over 100 of criminal proceedings initiated in this area. Let me explain you the scheme. There were some contractors, and they started working. Then they stopped working. They increased the cost of the services, expecting for further money from the state budget. And then by the end of the year, we had unfinished works and constructions, and the budgets were significantly higher. And we have an unfinished construction of the barracks, and their condition is getting worse and worse. And there's over 100 examples around Ukraine. I can give you a few more examples. In Mykolaiv Oblast, in Khmelnytska Oblast, particularly the regiment that I belong to, it also has a number of unfinished construction of the barracks. Then there is a naval center of operations, which still needs 40 million hryvnia for building the mass hall, and they continue to use the tents as their mass halls. These are the other barracks where it's still lacking the money to finalize their construction. Still, the money were allocated, and were not allocated, and part of the money were spent to support social programs. Now, another aspect would be the implementation of the civilian oversight, and it's not only about the National Security and Defense Committee. It's all about the government. It's all about the other ministries and agencies that are coordinating the orders of the MOD, and of course the civilian representatives. And unfortunately, we don't have any of the representatives from the National Defense and Security Committee or the political party, the leading political party. Maybe they would be able to explain us how this is happening and why, or how they could overcome this situation. As the civilian oversight, that's something we need to focus. And I raised this issue last year. There were some questions about the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Mr. Halimon, for his improficiency. And finally, he was dismissed from service in July, and he was turned into advisor. And because of the significant problems with the food supply to the military personnel. Why the government waited for 4 months and didn't take any decisions? By the way, the tenders were not announced for the procurement of food for the next year. And for those of you watching us, I need to explain that it's not about, how the food is being supplied or how the food is cooked. I would like to focus everyone's attention on which food products are being supplied to the commanders of the military units. In some cases, the military unit commanders are conspiring with the suppliers, but of course there is a control in progress. In some cases, the military commanders would refuse accepting the products because they are not complying with the standards. And one of the monopoly suppliers of food, he went further. They opened the representative offices in every oblast of Ukraine. So maybe next year we'll have a requirement in the tender documents to have for the suppliers to have representative offices in every oblast of Ukraine. But I'd like to focus 3 major aspects and the risks that we have to eradicate. First, we need to minimize the conspiracy between the producers and those who receive the supplies. We need to, recall the Pashinsky's situation, how the procurements were made under him, and we need to recall the situation around the Agrinol, and we need to focus our attention on the food supply. And 2 of the people from the political party Za Życia has presented some documents in advance of the bidding, preventing others to compete. And some of the even though their supplier were offering the largest price for their funds, so the budget was losing significant money out of those contracts. Then there is the eliminating of the possibility of approving the manufacturing processes. So, with regards to the tents, and I'm sure every military personnel would indicate that there is an improper quality of the tents and that they're not complying with any standards, even the Soviet standards, by the way. And since the Department of Procurement identifies the technical specifications of the tents, then the producer could be able to adjust those specifications and have them coordinated by the MOD. And in this case, we could have only one company could be able to participate in this tender because they only the one to comply with the specifications. Then there is a change in the overall national standards. We are talking about the national Soviet time standards. Once again, I'd like to focus our attention about the POL. That's the Agrinol company. When there are only two companies that comply with the national specifications, so only them could participate in the bidding processes, and the others are not able to participate. So we have this overall conspiracy in between of the public officials and representatives of either the National Security and Defense Committee. And of course, in some cases, the military personnel are establishing their own companies. They're doing their products in a quality manner, and that's the right story of socialization of the military personnel. So I'm happy with that. But whenever there are corruption risks, whenever the procurements are done at a price which is 2 or 3 times higher than the average price for the population, then I think that's the criminal aspects that should be prosecuted, really. So we do have to make sure that those are still in progress, as unfortunately the prosecutor's office is not finalizing the criminal proceedings.
Thank you, Ms. Bobrovsky, for your information. After this input, I'm sure we will have more questions for the Ministry of Defense. It's a shame that we don't have the representative of the parliamentary committee. It would be great to talk to them in details about their stance on lowering the level of secrecy in the defense procurements. We communicated with the NAKO State Watch and other institutions. We hear more and more claims about their stance is not very clear. Hopefully we will clarify that in the future. All right. We could have some questions for Igor Chukhrai and the deputy head of the Department of Public Procurement, Volodymyr Stetsy. Let's start with you, please. We do have a lot of allegations about substandard anti-corruption procedures at the Ministry of Defense. What can you say as for anti-corruption efforts undertaken by the MOD, and what can be done in order to bring Ukraine from D to better groups according to the GDI scores? Dear participants of the discussion, I am happy to greet all of you at this important event. Let me greet you with the Anti-Corruption Day. The fact that we are here now speaks for itself. We don't want to be tolerant towards corruption. As it was said by both the minister and the commander-in-chief, the anti-corruption and prevention of corruption is the top priority for the Ministry of Defense and the entire sector. And these two public officers publicly claimed their stance towards corruption. They are aware of the level of corruption in the current situation, and they are quite stringent towards their subordinates in this regard. We understand how much anti-corruption affects the processes in the armed forces in this entire sector. And every officer who is managing respective units has to be fully aware of the anti-corruption procedures that have to be implemented. There are authorized units, including our administration, that have to implement anti-corruption measures. Let me briefly tell you about what we do. Since this event is organized by the NAKO organization, our cooperation with NAKO was launched in 2016. We signed a memorandum between the Ministry of Defense and the Transparency International Ukraine. So based on this memorandum, we have full-scale cooperation. We have a number of joint events and measures, especially this year. Like diplomats say, I would be quite cautious to assess our cooperation, but I'm sure that when the study of 2021 is done in the future, we will be sure to see better scores of Ukraine. In the context of our cooperation with NAKO, they sent assessors, and we, on our part, appointed the first deputy of the head of the department. This is how we built our work together. We also engaged NGOs and other institutions in this anti-corruption effort, but I'd like to highlight that NAKO recommendations were quite valuable to us in this anti-corruption work. NAKO has demonstrated a number of studies results which we used in our work with the military defense procurement and fighting illicit trade with the occupied territories and high level of secrecy, unnecessary level of secrecy. When we identified corruption risks in the most vulnerable areas, we identified 58 corruption risks. And based on this number, we implemented 126 measures to fight those risks, to mitigate those. Don't worry, our interpreters are working. As for the corruption risks assessed by our commission, NAKO has played an active role in this work, and we took into consideration all their guidelines and recommendations, namely management of land and residential facilities, reformation of public property, supplying fuel and food to the armed forces. Am I right? Yes, absolutely. The key factor of success for us is independence, objectivity, impartiality, critical thinking. Without these approaches, we would never be able to build integrity and safe society. Now, concerning the next points, what measures we have taken to fight corruption and what strategic documents we have in this field. The strategy of military security, national security of Ukraine, strategic defense bulletin of Ukraine. In the context of already adopted anti-corruption program, we annually specify priorities in anti-corruption field in order to implement these policies on each level. Igor, you as the head of the department, respective department, What can you say about what Solomia Bobrovska was saying? These schemes related to Halimon and this proxy company participating in this corruption scheme. Has your department taken part in this fight with corruption, or what can you say about that? We have considered the risks identified, and we integrated those risks, the assessment of those risks, into the new program. And the representative of the public procurement department was also engaged in the process to prevent further violations. Do you usually consider what the civil society has to say with regard of anti-corruption measures? On 2nd November this year, NABU alleged that Leshchenko had some shady background, and ex-minister Taran was appointed as the head of the public property fund. Let's remember that he was accused of some corruption schemes. This appointment was performed without clearance from our side. We just learned about it, and then we initiated some assessment and vetting procedure. This person was dismissed, and we responded quite promptly, immediately, I would say. If I may, I would like to engage the deputy head of the Department of the Anti-Corruption, Serhiy Terkach. Serhiy, we are now listening to the representatives of the Ministry of Defense. What can you say about the measures taken by the MOD? Are these measures sufficient or not for your institution? It should be also a priority, right? Thank you for your question, dear colleagues. I first would like to say that the topic we're talking about, prevention of corruption and fighting corruption, is one of the top priorities on the state level. The state policy is quite indicative of that, and our institution, National Corruption Prevention Commission, has this separate block dedicated to preventing corruption in the defense sector. This draft law was adopted in the first reading, and we really hope that the Parliament of Ukraine would finalize the adoption of the draft law by the end of this year. This would mean that our state would be moving towards lower corruption quite soon and quite effectively. One of the top areas where we see high corruption risk is defense sector, and what the state is doing and what our agency, what kind of role our agency has to play in this anti-corruption activities. I would say the following. We see that some laws were adopted. Olena, correct me if I'm wrong. GDI you were presenting was about 2019 and 2020, right? Yes, that's correct. But in 2021, our country continued moving on this path of fighting corruption in defense sector. We had this new law on defense procurement, and it would make the entire procedure of procurement more transparent and effective. On top of that, we also had this new law on reforming enterprises in defense sector. Corporatization of enterprises is a separate area of work, which is aimed not only at streamlining and improving efficiency, but also fighting corruption. The third block, anti-corruption strategy, which I already mentioned. So the risks we faced were reflected in the strategy. It's quite a unique document. It reflects the entire number of risks and also indicates specific results achieved in this field. The state program, which is going to be adopted in order to implement this strategy, anti-corruption strategy, will have a clear action plan aimed at mitigating these risks. And that would include corporatization of enterprises. We have identified the key gaps in land management, immovable property management, construction documents, and we have the separate topic, personnel issues, the conscription period, appointing people to new positions in the armed forces. These processes have quite high risks of corruption. Sergei, if I may, could you give us more specific numbers as for how many cases you transferred to the NABU? I cannot give you the numbers. My institution is not dealing with criminal proceedings, but we know that the police and respective law enforcement have hundreds of these criminal cases. National Anti-Corruption Bureau and National Bureau of Investigations. These are two key institutions. Our two main areas where we are trying to fight corruption include anti-corruption expert assessment in regulatory acts sent to the cabinet. Before they reach the cabinet of ministers, we, as an institution responsible for fighting corruption, check them. Last year we worked a lot with the bylaws in the field of defense procurement. There were a lot of corruption risks identified by us. We provided our recommendations, guidelines with that regard. We now optimized these documents to avoid corruption risks. I am really grateful to NAKO for cooperation and their support. We now started this assessment and analysis of regulatory acts. We now registered a draft law at the Parliament of Ukraine about providing residential facilities for the military of Ukraine. We assessed the documents drafted in the first place, and we saw how the commission was supposed to be composed and how they would decide on whom to give those apartments. This is going to later become privately owned land plots and residential facilities. So we were looking into those matters, and we have a separate area of our work related to Ukroboronprom. We work together with our colleagues from State Watch. We identified 15 top risks in the management of Ukroboronprom. At the moment, they are now going through corporatization. It was quite a lengthy and thorough procedure implemented by us. We identified that in the past several years, this concern was quite politically engaged, and this resulted in a lot of corruption schemes we were able to find. The key, though, in this study was we came up with guidelines on mitigating corruption risks. We also developed action plan to achieve lower corruption risks and how to avoid further corruption in the context of Ukroboronprom. We want them to be as transparent as possible. If you want to have more specific example, when Kyiv tank plant buys 3 very expensive cars and a motorbike for the public money, it's a questionable case, definitely. Or when a helicopter is sold for scrap metal, this is also something shady. One enterprise takes their unique construction documents for aircraft and transfer these documents to some outside enterprise. This is again something which is quite indicative of corruption. And we actually indicated these identified cases in our documents assessment. Okay, let's get back to what you said. You assessed in improved documents to be submitted to the Cabinet of Ministers, and these were the regulatory acts. So, as far as I know, as I'm concerned, this law doesn't work properly now. What kind of procurement are now going on? We have Volodymyr Stasi here with us, so could you please comment on that?
So could you please tell us how the defense procurements are currently conducted and how the civil society can get the information whether the national funds are being spent in a rational and effective manner? Well, first of all, I'd like to say that while implementing a series of legal acts, the employees of our department were engaged together with the representatives of the specialized units of the MOD, as well as the representatives of the Independent Anti-Corruption Commission. So they've participated in identifying the corruption risks of the MOD, and they also participated in in developing the anti-corruption program for the upcoming year at the MOD. So they've submitted proposals on public procurements as the result of such work. I would also like to mention, with regards to centralized public procurements, what are those? The centralized public procurements are conducted in order to satisfy the needs of the armed forces of Ukraine through centralized procurements of the goods and services in the field of logistics. We're talking about food, clothes, POLs, and others. I would like to mention that this year, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine has approved the law on defense procurements that entered into force on the 1st of January of 2021. But it's not active. Look, the law on defense procurements, but it's not working. Look, well, it's entered into force. It is entered into force, but the problem is, or the question is, whether the procurements are being conducted in accordance with this law. If yes, then why the Cabinet of Ministers have voted for the dismissal of the state defense order in July? Well, the law on defense procurements, it's working, and we have the public procurements organized in accordance with the PROZOR. Look, in accordance with this law, the procurements should be conducted with the use of the registers of the manufacturers of products under the SDO, but we don't have the register. And the Ministry for Strategic Planning still has an Excel table with the list of a series of companies that would like to be joined to this register. There's 82 out of 300 that should be there in the register. So I don't think we can say that this law is actually entered into force. I'm the Colonel Chebban from the Department of Military Technical Policy. Look, this is more of a question to our department because we are the one engaged in the fulfillment of the SDO. So I believe the questions should be addressed to us with regards to the law on defense procurements. Okay, good, perfect. Then could you please continue with answering this question, because we still have it in the air, and in the frames of our discussion, we do have a lot of conversations with regards to, lowering or declassifying some of the information with regards to the employment of SDO. So could you please tell us what is the percentage in the defense budget of the UK is classified? So which part of the defense budget of the UK is considered classified, and under which areas?
Exact figures I can't give you, but it's very low, and it mostly focuses on our nuclear capacity.
Okay,
So it
but
focuses on.
very low. It's about 10%, 15%.
I'd say less than 10%.
Less than 10%.
When you're looking at our
Ми говоримо про те, що
Just that we're saying so less than 10% of defense procurements are classified. That's the indicators for the UK defense budget. So, talking about the secrecy, it's all about the developments of nuclear weapons. Anything else you can add to that?
supporting special forces is generally classified. So, special forces procurement, special forces development is often classified systems. Anything that is generic in terms of supporting the armed forces of the UK. So, fuel, food, all of those things, those are unclassified, and we report to Parliament on them every year. We have to submit a report to Parliament, and that report to Parliament is made public.
Okay.
So all of that information is available.
Окей, ми говоримо про те, що
So, we're saying that some of the areas of the defense budget of UK is classified with regards particularly to those procurements dealing with the special operation forces and some of the nuclear aspects, but I think 100% of our SDO is classified. Well, actually, more or less 100%. We have 92%. He's the head of the special project, which is dealing specifically with defense procurements. So, you've been long in this topic. You've been working for many years in this topic, so, and you cooperate with the committee of the Verkhovna Rada. So, what's the attitude of the Verkhovna Rada committee on declassifying? And what is the level of declassification? Because there are certain people that appeal against declassifying this information, saying that we are in a state of war. We are talking with the committee in this area. In the same time, I'd like to comment whether we should do that or should not do that amidst the aggression. There's two major aspects. First is the political component. We, as the democratic state, which complies with all the international norms and rules, we have to use the deterrence strategy, which is something that we are fulfilling that right now. That is to elevate the price that the aggressor would have to pay for the aggression. This is something we are doing. And the MOD said that we would need the Afghan weapons in order to reinforce our capabilities and before the aggression. If we are publicly demonstrating the increase of the capabilities, then with every demonstration we would sort of reinforce the deterrence. If we increase our capabilities and resources, we also increase the capability. And I mean, classifying defense procurements, that would be more of a prerogative of the country willing to attack secretly. That is why we have to open up the information on the development of capabilities. And this would bring us closer to the other allies and partners under NATO. And I hope that that was the logic behind the work of the Committee on the Law on Public Procurements and Defense Procurements. There were a lot of statements with regards to how to declassify the SDO. That's the Soviet practice, which is not complying with the actual needs of the armed forces. Although, as of now, the position of the Ukrainian authority and the parliament and the committee has changed. And currently, the issue of declassifying the fulfilled contracts as well as the future procurements is not on the agenda, as the committee has withdrawn the draft law that was developed together with the experts over a year and a half, and that draft law had to, correct some of the mistakes that were made in the previous legislation with regards to declassification. Although after 3 hearings, the committee has withdrawn this draft law and demonstrated the position that it's not supporting further declassifying of the information. Yes, they are currently working on the draft law on the secrecy, but still there are many controversies with regards to the positions. There's definitely a change in the position of the committees. Are we talking about the complete change in the policy with regards to the declassifying? And we saw that clearly at the GDI index. So we don't understand the position of the Verkhovna Rada committee. Speaking on the practical aspect, whether we are practically capable of declassifying information amidst the war against Russia. The practice is all the same. When we started this work in the MOD, we draw a sort of conventional line because it was very hard to calculate everything. So we thought that at least half of the information could be declassified and it will not pose any risks. Let's get some examples, really, because going outside of the expert environment, the people want to have some examples. So if we publish information, how many tanks we've bought for the armed forces, would that pose a risk? No, it's not. Whenever we bought any new tanks or helicopters or APCs, whenever we refurbished them, remember we had them demonstrated on the drilling ground. Everything was on the media. So we are classifying not the quantity of what has been procured, and this is something that we're demonstrating on the drill grounds, that the president officially will transfer those equipment to the military units. We are classifying not the numbers, but the price. Really, this is something that we are classifying. We are classifying the price of the contract and the manufacturer. And this is something that I would like to draw everyone's attention to, because together with NAKO, we've run a poll and a survey among the volunteer organizations in Ukraine. We've asked over 40 of different volunteering organizations of different scope, and we asked them what have they supplied to the armed forces and some of the units over 2021. That was a survey done online. Of course, you can question that survey, but since I've been in a volunteer movement for over 7.5 years, I would say that this information is absolutely true. We are saying about some of the items that the state has to procure under the SDO. Still, the volunteers are maintaining their supplies to the units in the east. We're talking about the vehicles, we're talking about medical evacuation vehicles, and whenever I come to a different military unit, there is only a medical evacuation vehicle that was bought by volunteers. I've just returned from Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. I've seen 13 military units, and I've talked to commanders of the military units. And he said that that is the Bogdan, which was supplied by the Ministry of Defense. No, he's saying, in order to drive to the front line, I'm using my personal transport. And by the way, volunteers keep supplying the spare parts in order to do the maintenance for the vehicles. Then the UAVs, we're talking about the quadricopters and the unmanned aerial vehicles. This is one of the largest areas in terms of the spendings of volunteers over the previous year. And we're talking about large numbers, large amount of funds for the volunteers. This year I have bought over 100 UAVs. That's several million hryvnias. For a volunteer, that's a significant amount of money that I could have spent on some other areas. But this is all something that should be procured under the SDO. Yet we don't know what are the numbers of procurement and what is the price. Just recently we have received a presentation, and we've seen the CNC Zaluzhny, and he was carrying the anti-drone rifles. There were 2 of them, and those rifles were bought by the volunteers. It's significant numbers in order to supply that to military units around the front line. So a question that is something very interesting to me. What is the price of a single anti-drone rifle in accordance with our procurements from the defense budget? I mean, what is the price that we as the volunteers paid for those rifles? This is something that I know, but I'm interested, and we paid, couple of them just piece by piece, and I'm interested. What is the price for paying that by the state? That's I guess only the only type of weapon the MOD managed to buy through the agency, and they have the annual procurement plans on that very specific. And we can find the information on the procurement price. All I'm saying that within a year, all the volunteers all have bought something like 500 UAVs, and the quadricopter on the front line, it's a kind of a spare material really on the front line. It's more expensive than ammo, but still it's something like a spare unit. I mean, earlier they could be using a couple of months along the front lines. And now the quadricopter could leave for a couple of days or maybe a week, because Russians have increased their capabilities in terms of anti-drone units. So we have to buy a lot of them. And in order to buy the quadricopters or UAVs, we would need to pay like 40 million hryvnias. That's a lot of money for volunteers, but I don't think that's a lot of money for state budget, state defense budget. So we are willing to understand what prevents our MOD, the specialized committee, and the rest of the stakeholders from declassifying information on the prices in order for us to understand how our public officials are spending our money. Looking at the abuses in public procurements, we have a logical question. Hey, what is happening in other procurements which are classified 100%? So there's a question to you, gentlemen. Thank you. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Chebin from the Department of Military Technical Policy, and my department is dealing with the procurement of weapons and material. We hear a lot of political mottos and slogans and media attacks that this is not right and we have to do something and somebody's stealing the money. Look, let me explain how the system is working. And it's working in the same very manner as it is working in the UK and in Canada. Now, the customer identifies what we should need to buy. So the armed forces clearly indicate what should we buy. Whenever we receive the funds, then we initiate the procurement of certain products. We are procuring what the general staff is saying to us within the funds that are allocated by the state. Out of 131 billion Ukrainian hryvnia, then we are planning to spend a lot of money under these 3-year SDO, and it has the sensitive data, and it's not that something is willing. There's the requirement of the legislation. It has some information that are considered state secret. So we are, as the Ukrainians, as the citizens, we cannot violate the legislation and cannot take the decisions that we are capable of disclosing some information. That's speaking on the secrecy. Speaking on publications, the MOD has made a decision to have this 3-year plan posted on the website of the MOD. So it will be posted. Speaking on the work of the department in the field of anti-corruption, I would like to say that first, as a representative of the department, I actively participate in anti-corruption program, And we had discussions with the representatives of NAKO, but stepping away from slogans and mottos, certain provisions that are very hard to implement and still their efficiency is questionable. And my personal point, and I think many others would share this point as well, particularly those representing state manufacturers, there are provisions that have no sense at all, although they require a lot of work to be implemented. That's an interagency commission on the efficiency of the procurement procedure for products, works, and services of defense nature for the cost of over 200 million. So we do have this interagency commission. What's the purpose of that? Their decisions are not mandatory, they're recommended, or they only suggest recommendations, but we would need to spend a lot of time on that. Speaking of the pricing process is lengthy and difficult. Unfortunately, we do have the calculatory documents. This is something that I don't think the UK has, and definitely Canadians don't have things like that. And unfortunately, we have those kind of pricing tables and pricing materials. And what prevents us from withdrawing from those materials? I don't know. Well, does that bother you? Well, my personal point is that that's a significant, well, that's the aspect that we need to spend a lot of hours and works to fulfill. And how do you communicate this challenge? Well, that was something that was mentioned by the Ministry of Strategic Policies, although there are certain aspects that we clearly understand that you won't be able to buy just right now, just like that.
Let me finish. In terms of the work of the MOD and the department in anti-corruption area, first of all, let me say that we are fully open and we are ready to implement your recommendations. Unfortunately, at some point, we were not receiving those on time, but once we see something which is recommended, quite often they are de facto integrated into the practices and documents. As for the National Corruption Prevention Agency, again, we want to see more realistic mechanisms, not mottos and political slogans. Now about secrecy, and we are going to publish what we are procuring. We cannot publish the integrated annual plan because some parts of these documents are state secret. But what we can, we will publish. On top of that, we've established a dedicated commission on public procurement. The order has been issued to establish this commission. It was a hard step for us, but we have managed to take it, and we would really be aiming at creating an effective mechanism that would enable us to procure what's necessary on time and report back to taxpayers of Ukraine, and do so in the most effective manner with the lowest possible losses, including the reputation losses. Thank you. Gleb Kanevsky. Would it be sufficient for us to see regular publications of the Ministry of Defense in terms of what they buy, or would it be necessary also to know how much they paid for what they've bought? What practical recommendations would you be able to give to effectively fight corruption on the level of the Ministry of Defense? Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. Let me say that we as State Watch are trying hard to get sufficient data to implement civilian oversight. At the moment, this is not possible. The MOD, in their budgetary reports on the programs they are implementing, are not providing the information on the procurement. I mean, of course, they publish something, but it's so scarce that it's hard for us to understand what exactly they bought. Based on calculations of NAKO, up to 2024, the budgetary requests from the MOD for procurement and maintenance of equipment, they requested for over 100 million hryvnias. Without any changes, they can have direct contracts without any disclosing of prices and items to be bought. Let me voice an opinion which is based on numerous studies conducted by NAKO, myself, my colleagues, journalists. In September 2021, the Ministry of Defense, after a court decision, paid over 19 million hryvnias to a private company for supplying ambulances in the framework of public defense procurement. The court decision contains all the details, what kind of vehicles they procured, how much they paid. If we are trying to hide something from Russia, it's one attitude. The other attitude is I can enter the court decision register and see this information based on this trial, which was lost by the Ministry of Defense, of course, because they had overdue payment. One vehicle cost around 2.5 million hryvnias. I cannot see any details. Maybe they are equipped with super unique, modern, sophisticated equipment, but Prozoro shows that ambulances and these evacuation vehicles can be procured at a much lower prices. MOD procures a lot of things under this umbrella of secrecy. If they disclose this information, this is going to undermine the defense capability of the state. Yes, this is their statement. Declassification. Why cannot ministry work together with the committee, with the Artur, to declassify what can be declassified? Why is the ministry not trying to be a headliner in lowering the level of secrecy, declassifying what can be declassified? We could have parts of the contracts seen by the civilian oversight entities, and that would save them a lot of problems related to criminal cases initiated by NABU, State Investigation Bureau, and so on. So I believe the best step the MOD can take is to own this process and lead it, so to say. If the MOD is not doing that, we as an expert in environment and community are going to pose pressure on them. Without their own initiative, it would take longer, but we will get there anyways. Thank you. We have director of, I'm sorry, the this foundation, Army SOS. Almost everyone serving in the artillery forces has kind of equipment and weapons procured by you. Do you have any questions or comments for representatives of public authorities fighting corruption who are here with us today? Thank you very much. Serhiy mentioned vehicles, copters. We were also procuring this kind of equipment. Among other volunteers, we are associated with some kind of equipment, specific types of equipment. We procure a lot of personal equipment for the armed forces. If we have some requests from the military men themselves, and they are still lacking a lot of personal equipment, and this is something quite ordinary now, we have this impression that it's convenient for the armed forces of Ukraine to ask volunteers for help, for assistance. Starting 2014 and 2014, this was something quite normal. I remember they didn't even have sufficient number of printed maps, and we had dozens of requests to procure tablets for the military men. But now the situation has to change. From outside, this situation could look weird, but somehow the armed forces of Ukraine perceive it as something normal when volunteers procure what's necessary for the military men. They seem not to be willing to change things in this field. I can corroborate and say that starting July last year, when the order of the president of Ukraine was issued about this ceasefire in the east, in over a year, when we have banned for surveillance flights, they anyway were compelled to do so, but they used volunteers as a support. If our aerial vehicle was downed on the other side of the front line, they lost it, of course, and they again turned to volunteers to have another one procured. As for the vertical of collecting information about what's necessary, what's on demand, it's totally relying on human factor. Let's be honest here. You all know how the defense requests are changing by the end of the year compared to the planned procurement at the beginning of the year. The representatives of the MOD usually attend these committee sessions at the parliament and ask these plans to be amended. So I am particularly interested in how we can fight corruption risks, how we can improve our practices and line them with the best practices from our international experts. We are really grateful to Zaluzhny, who is now attending another meeting. It's a very good example of how communication is improving. We have great hope for Reznikov's efforts taken in this area, which failed actually during the office of the previous minister. And we have to enhance civilian oversight over expenditures in defense sector. And the parliamentary control has to be effective as well. And that would help us see effective numbers, effective figures, how much money is spent by the state for the front. I know that we do have representatives of Ukroboronprom here in the room. If you are willing to make your contribution, to provide your input, please go ahead. Plus, we have media representatives. If you also have some comments or questions, please, you can take the floor. Don't forget to introduce yourself. Good afternoon, Olga Abramova, the head of the Department of Managing the Assets of Ukroboronprom. We do know about corruption risks, and we have this memorandum signed. We have taken some steps to minimize, to mitigate risk of corruption. We introduced an extra program to that end. We enhanced the requirements for transparency in our business processes, in decision making, in handling our assets and property, especially in managing our property. Now, any property that is about to be signed off has to be published. We use all the transparency mechanisms. We have them in place. This policy has been adopted at our agency, and it, of course, yields some significant results, including the monetary savings. We see more money in influx of money, and we decreased the array of assets that is not used properly. The NGOs and the National Agency of Corruption Prevention are always by our side to keep an eye on our anti-corruption measures. We also have our code of conduct, which is also aiming at the same objectives, and we are now going through a transformation of the Ukronobronprom concern to introduce best practices of governance and management. Dear colleagues, if we have any questions for our esteemed guests, please, you can take the floor.
I believe there are no questions. Oh, indeed, we do have a question, please. Mikhailo Dotsenko, the Ukraine-US Business Council. I have a question to the MOD as the agency which defines the policy. And can you please tell us whether the Ministry of Defense is considering, I know that it depends on the Ministry of Finance, but are you planning to somehow deal with the situation around the long-term contracts with the manufacturers of the products? We've mentioned a lot of that in our conversations with the Ukronobronprom, and in Washington, two problems are maintained on our agenda. The first problem and challenge, that's the secrecy. We've talked a lot about that. And the second challenge is uncertainty with regards to the SDO, meaning the manufacturers should understand whether they should maintain the manufacturing of ammunition or their presence in certain regions. This lack of long-term planning is something which is significantly affecting the capabilities of the manufacturers. So could you please tell us what the ministry is thinking about? That's a very vague question. What would you like to hear in terms of the long-term planning from the ministry? Whether they cooperate with the Ministry of Finance on this area, and whether they're planning to have a 3-year contracting under the SDO, or maybe even 5-year contracting under the SDO. So thank you. Thank you for the question. Look, from the very first part of this question with regards to the secrecy, as Sergei already mentioned, that's a very vague question. The contents of the new law on defense procurements, the MOD as one of the customers under the SDO, they would buy a certain product. If that's a product which is procured under the classified procedure, then that would go to the unified classifier of the manufacturers. They will look at the availability of the enterprises that confirm their capability to produce certain product. There will be 3 enterprises ready for that. That would be invited into the tender, and then the decision that would be taken through negotiations on contracting. So there will be a register updated by the Ministry of Strategic Industries. They will maintain this register, so all the state customers would be using that register in order to get the information on those legal entities which are capable of performing the works or services. Speaking on the planning, we do have the planning. So every SDO we had was an SDO for 3 years, and this comprehensive or combined plan is also done for 3 years. The only question we have is that we are waiting for the annual budgetary allocations. And only when we do have them, we will have the numbers that we understand which we could spend. So the SDOs, we do have those SDOs for 3 years, but we still need to wait for budgetary allocations. Look, speaking on the foreign suppliers, we are actively cooperating with the foreign advisors. We are having a lot of debates with them. There is a very simple fact, and it's not a secret to anyone. Unfortunately, the defense budget of the MOD and the number of procurements that we are doing and this political environment around us, it prevents us from telling the global corporations that we are ready to allocate significant amount of money over a period of 5 years, for example. If the Canada is buying like a significant number of F-35s, okay, that's good, but we're not able to afford it themselves. If we would be able to afford significant procurements at this enormous amount of money, that would be more interesting for corporations. Well, you are covering very important aspects, in fact, too many aspects, and particularly the aviation. Our society knows that our armed forces is capable of, has a lot of capabilities, although our aircrafts are fairly obsolete, and in 5 to 10 years we won't have any aircraft to fly it. Currently, the most advanced aircraft that we had was adopted in 1995. And we can easily come up with the aircraft that were adopted by the armed forces, I don't know, so many years ago. Because buying aircraft, that's the smallest problem. We could use loans from US or France or any other country. But buying an aircraft, that's only part of the problem. You would need to maintain that. You would need to train the personnel how to fly that. You would need to supply the land infrastructure. You would need to supply the ammunition for that aircraft. And in certain cases, you would need to change the landing strips. And with all due respect to our country and the MOD, we won't be able to fulfill those projects on our own. Mr. Malloy, that was just a small hint that we won't be able to do such products on our own. So if you could be able to speak with Her Highness on that. If you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, please, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Okay, if everything understood everything over the conversation that we had, then let me express words of gratitude for your attention. Hopefully it was interesting. Hopefully you had some very important information for yourself, and you'll be able to communicate that information later on. So please stay in touch and monitor the whole situation, because those people that, NAKO, State Watch, and other agencies, representatives of the MOD, representatives of the Specialized Committee, well, they tend to talk in between one another too many times. And the more people would address the challenges that we have mentioned today, I believe the better would be the processes. Should we keep the final words for the MOD? I'd like to underline that we had a lot of questions around secrecy and the role of the MOD. Just wanted to say that the MOD is interested in declassifying, really, and we are doing a lot of steps to support this. The thing that we are facing a lot of resistance in our work, and can you have a question? Look, the ministry whether the Ministry of Defense is ready to submit a draft bill on introducing amendments to the law on state secrecy. The MOD has already made those steps. We could have a conversation on that. Look, we had a trouble or a challenge last year because all those requests to the MOD, the Ministry of Strategic Industries, they were sort of neglected. And last year we had a change of the leadership in those ministries in the MOD, and in the very last hours of the previous MOD, there were very interesting appointments. Then Ruski left. He, he dismissed his deputies, and at certain point, the State Secretariat had a lot of troubles with the appointing of new government officials. Hopefully the situation changed for the better. So let's get from mottos to actions. But look, you are the ministry that develops the policies. So if you have troubles with policy development, there are people willing you to help. So please try not to ignore their express willingness to help. So we heard what the public agencies are willing to do in order to improve the situation with the anti-corruption, with the corruption risks. We've heard the experts. We've heard the National Agency for Corruption Prevention. We've I've heard Olena, and in summary, I would like to wish all of us to take all the efforts possible in order to implement everything that was mentioned by the MOD, so that we would change the category D into the category C under the Defense Integrity Index. Thank you.